Hello, I am Javier Livas. In this video, I will talk about capitalism's cybernetic supremacy and why socialism does not work. When the Berlin Wall fell 30 years ago, most people thought that Soviet Union-style socialism was the biggest loser. Was that exactly true? No. There was another, more powerful explanation. A couple of years before, James Gleick had published his book Chaos, The Birth of a New Science, and in it was the now famous butterfly effect, and it explained how highly complex systems, such as the Soviet Union, were subject to sudden catastrophic change. 2 years after the wall came down, the Soviet Union ceased to exist, and the cybernetic paradigm was validated as the expert in dealing with complex systems. It was a new paradigm, a new scientific paradigm that defeated the Soviet Union in the eyes of the intellectual world. In the past 30 years since the wall fell, cybernetics has continued to grow, although sometimes with other names, such as complexity science, complex system science, artificial intelligence, information theory, and so on. Amazingly, the world of politics has hardly become aware that there are cybernetic laws in existence, as valid and hard as Newton's laws of physics. This lack of awareness has had fatal consequences, as the rivalry between capitalism and socialism, or even communism, has generated wars with millions of dead victims. Without an apparent rival to stop it, capitalism spread all over the planet. The Russian privatized their own way, generating big energy bosses. The Chinese imported thousands of American plants and started hijacking all the patents they could get their hands on. But also in these past 30 years, cybernetics transformed technology and human life itself. We've got personal computers, the internet, the iPhone and its clones, and what we call social networks. The cost of economic transactions came down to a few pennies, and we have seen the surge of Amazon and eBay and many other online stores. Anyone can publish his ideas and be heard. The world said hello to Facebook, YouTube, Google, Twitter, Instagram, and so on. It is all due to cybernetics and the capitalist economies it has helped develop. Today, however, capitalism is being blamed for human exploitation in the maquiladora sweatshops and for air, water, and earth pollution. Even climate change is blamed on capitalism. So, thanks to systemic blindness and ignorance of cybernetics, socialism has now resurged as a solution to planetary problems. Imagine. About 50 or more percent of American students in the US consider socialism as the antidote against the apparent failures of capitalism. I think it is never too late to explain the grave mistake they have been led to support. Please consider this. Cybernetics is not only about computers. In fact, it deals with the laws of control that allowed the invention of computers. These are hard laws, and they were first discovered in nature and then translated into the world of computers and software and programming. These are the natural laws that allowed living things to process information without the use of electronics or computers. The human brain and nervous system is perhaps the best example. These cybernetic laws are the laws that talk about channel capacity and the communication limits of a given message. For instance, cybernetics, in its information theory expert capacity, invented the bit as a unit of information just enough to distinguish between heads and tails, a binary 50-50 situation. With that settled, billions and even trillions of bits and bytes and terabytes are now used to create a world of information that runs parallel to the material world we see around us. But there is more. When applied to management, the cybernetic laws of control and information generated the viable system model proposed by Professor Stafford Beer, a master cybernetician born in England. He discovered that these cybernetic laws and principles apply to all living things that are capable of an independent existence, including human organizations, from a small business to the nation state. It is these laws and principles which explain why capitalism defeated socialism. It is not enough to say that it is just because capitalism is more efficient or that it has better motivation mechanisms than socialism. We have to say why in terms of these cybernetic laws and principles. I will be presenting them, these cybernetic arguments, shortly. The laws and principles behind all viable systems, including as such the tiniest of cells, persons, and public and private organizations, including the nation state, allows us to compare capitalism and socialism using the same intellectual framework that is not necessarily hinged to economic production levels, but to a cybernetic capability and efficacy. The main law of control is called Ashby's law, or the law of requisite variety, shown above. This law was discovered by Ross Ashby, another British cybernetician and a friend of Stafford Beer. The law says simply, only variety absorbs variety. Although this sounds as a self-evident or tautological truth, it is not. Variety is a cybernetic technical term that is used to quantify a system's complexity, namely, the number of behaviors or different states it can show. Variety, then, is a measure of such complexity. So, when you want to control a system, this fundamental cybernetic law says that you need the regulator to match 1-to-1 all the variety the system you want to control can exhibit. If there is one behavior left out of the control scheme, the regulator will never gain control. For instance, if a football player is not marked by the defense, he might catch the pass and score a touchdown. I think this is not so difficult to understand. Now, the tricky thing about this law is that in order to match the system's variety, the one you want to control, then the control system must show some sort of capacity to figure out, guess, register, or compute the out of control variety in order to reply with a proper dose of regulating variety. Sometimes this matching can be achieved by cutting down the perturbance variety or by amplifying the regulatory variety. You cut variety by telling a child he cannot eat between meals, for instance. You amplify your variety by issuing a rule grounding him for misbehaving. People tend to think that computers are miraculous amplifiers of controlled variety, but cybernetic laws say that computing comes at a price, and, and a communication channel cannot transport unlimited amounts of information in 1 second. A 1 megabyte memory chip cannot hold 1 terabyte worth of information. A person is a transducer and as such is also limited as a communication channel. For instance, a blind person can have a gun, but he cannot aim it at someone effectively. Governments, on the other hand, attempt to violate cybernetic laws all the time without realizing that they are really trying something that is impossible. So we come to the fallacy of unlimited computer power. It is a very common mistake incurred by people that support socialist views. The Soviet Union, for instance, tried to create a huge computer network to run their socialist production plans, and they never got it right. They simply were ignoring Ashby's law. They were defeated by reality. The Soviet Empire collapsed, and the Russian Federation opened up to capitalistic methods that include private property rights. One of the key successes of capitalism is that every consumer is really like a decentralized computer operating a huge network with millions of connections to all other consumers and goods and services producers. Capitalism produces millions upon millions of computer operations and decisions outside the government's controlled sphere. These autonomous operations process loads and loads of information that no amount of computers can even begin to emulate. This is one of the major reasons why capitalism has outsmarted and outperformed socialism. In cybernetic terms, capitalism has been a better way of implementing Ashby's requisite variety law than socialism. And it gets a lot worse for socialism. As societies get increasingly complex, as variety explodes everywhere and generates increased behavior options and choices for consumers, it becomes also increasingly difficult for centralized planning to solve enough production to match a growing demand for goods and services. That is, capitalism not only generates an enormous amount of demand variety on behalf of the consumers, but it also uses the consumers themselves to satisfy such demand. This is Ashby's law way of getting solved on both sides of the control equation. Where else but in a capitalist environment would you get 100% satisfaction guaranteed or your money back? This ethical relationship between sellers and buyers is a typical capitalist way of to putting the consumer in the driver's seat. Try to get that in a socialist country and see what you get in response. Making both sides of the control variety equation to balance out, trying to match the demand variety with production variety has been socialism's mission impossible. This is the real hard science, factual reason why young Chinese in Hong Kong want capitalism and freedom and are not impressed by Beijing's apparent economic success. But many Latin American and American youngsters think they know better and are convinced that capitalism's many woes and faults can be fixed by returning history's clock back to the years of utopian socialist ideology. I say that the cybernetic arguments in favor of capitalism's superiority over socialism are overwhelming. The laws and principles of viability discovered by Stafford Beer are universally valid until someone can prove they are wrong. This is what Stafford Beer's laws and principles were encoded into the viable system model. I'll call them out one by one from 1 to 10. Number 1. Viable systems have evolved and are built from the bottom up. This is how nature did it. Capitalism does exactly this. It starts with the individual person. Socialism does not. It starts with a group on the top. Number 2. Viable systems are not hierarchical or based on authority. Capitalism wins again. Socialism is an authoritarian pyramid-like scheme from top to bottom, all the way down to the Cuban barrio inspector. Number 3. Viable systems rely on their members acting as free individuals or agents with the maximum possible autonomy. The limit is the cohesion of the whole, but not more. Capitalism wins again. Socialism cancels local autonomy. Again, a power group decides everything of any importance. Number 4. Viable systems evolve into the future by experimenting with different options. They take a more natural selection route. Capitalism wins again, although many businesses pay the ultimate price of going broke. Socialism assumes it can anticipate and predict the future and engages in central planning of goods and services. You can see for yourself. In China, there are thousands of brand new, empty condominium buildings and dozens of empty shopping malls without any clientele. Number 5. Viable systems make a very wise use of their coordination function. In the human body, it is called the autonomic nervous system. In business, it is known as the freedom of contract. Capitalism makes of freedom of contract its biggest and most effective tool for satisfying the control variety equation. Socialism does not grant freedom of contracts to anyone. all decisions are the product of centralized power. Requisite variety is achieved by filtering demand variety, not amplifying production variety. Number 6. Viable systems live in the border of thermodynamic chaos. This I get from the research made at the Santa Fe Institute of New Mexico. Viable systems, which are very complex, tend to self-organize, much like they were a living vortex, exchanging energy, materials, and information with their environment. This applies to businesses as well, or to nation states. This is very much the same strategy followed by capitalism, where businesses are free to choose their own luck. Socialism, on the contrary, tries to survive by canceling demand variety right and left. You cannot be surprised when an oil-rich country like Venezuela turns socialist by ignorant and unprepared socialist dictators starts rationing food. You want to know the inescapable truth? The truth is that socialism is a consequence of thinking in terms of Newton's billiard ball universe, which was the scientific paradigm when Karl Marx wrote his Das Kapital. Marx had the audacity of predicting that an historic triumph of the proletariat called communism was inevitable and would eventually arrive. Socialism, he said, was just a preparatory stage. Think about this later at your own expense. Number 7. Viable systems are sentient, and they can detect wrong moves and mistakes. They learn and adapt. Again, capitalism beats socialism in this regard. Capitalism has a system of justice to settle disputes and practices due process in finding the truth. Socialist countries do not have a free press, nor do they allow public and open criticism. Mistakes are covered up, as we saw happening in the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, which nearly killed millions. Number 8. Viable systems have a shared identity. In living organisms, every cell has a shared ID, which helps white cells to distinguish them from foreign bodies that have to be eliminated. Capitalist identity is very simple and can be expressed in a couple of rules. First, you are free, but you carry your own load of responsibilities. And second, constraints are decided by democratic means. That is what taxes are for. Socialism may win the quest for cohesion only because it forces cooperation upon the individual person. Your blood, sweat, and tears belong to the state. Number 9. All viable systems depend on a positive feedback to produce energy and a negative or control feedback to provide control. Again, capitalism wins because market activities emulate positive feedback and prices provide control feedback. Socialist energy comes from dogma, and control is monopolized by the state. Final point number 10. To control and be controlled at the same time are two sides of the same organic structure. Capitalism embraces this duality wholeheartedly. We, the people, exert control over our constitution, and by creating an institutionalized government structure with express powers, and then ensuring them ourselves that the government does not constrain our basic rights, such as liberty, the right to bear arms, freedom of the press, and freedom of religion. Socialism, on the other hand, is bent on preventing variety to be generated in the first place, and then suppressing whatever falls through the cracks. In conclusion, maybe it was due to sheer luck, but it should be very clear by the preceding explanations that cybernetic laws have been applied by capitalism in a very natural fashion, even before we could make those laws explicit through the revelation of the viable system model. Socialists, on the other hand, got stuck in the Newtonian view of a predictable billiard ball universe that allows you to plan the future by looking at the past. A total commitment to cause and effect. The world, however, especially that of human beings, is getting more complex by the minute and will only be understood by those with a minimum knowledge of cybernetics. So, the same science or paradigm, I should say, that gave us computers and internet and iPhones and social media is the same knowledge gathering paradigm that will open our eyes to the harsh reality that socialism has unavoidable limitations. If you want to continue believing in magic, that is entirely up to you. If you're still not convinced, read Senator Rand Paul's recently published book called The Case Against Socialism. He argues that socialism and its impotence eventually produced violence. It is well worth reading, but as we saw above, our arguments are based on cybernetics, not on the performance of capitalism or socialism. For those who are interested, I have many more videos on YouTube about the Bible system model and my Universal Management System 7 model, and about requisite variety, and about management cybernetics, and about Rosh Asby's introduction to cybernetics. Thank you for watching.